The Axios reports are noise. Dismiss them entirely. What is actually happening here is a calculated information operation, almost certainly tied to market positioning by people with direct access to White House intelligence flows. Someone made serious money off this. That is the real story sitting underneath the headlines. And until you understand that framing, everything else you read about this conflict will land in the wrong context. Iran's enriched uranium is not going anywhere. It stays inside Iran. That was always the position, and it has not shifted. What Tehran is demanding right now is not complicated. It is not irrational. It is not some maximalist opening bid designed to be walked back in negotiation. It is this and only this. Honor the ceasefire agreement that both sides accepted when the fighting stopped on day 39. That is the baseline. That is the floor. Everything beyond that is theater, and the theater is costing the world economy more with every passing week. When the guns paused on day 39, both parties had agreed to a regional ceasefire. The structure of that agreement was clear. It covered Lebanon, it covered Gaza, it covered the broader regional dimension of the conflict. What happened in the immediate aftermath of that agreement exposed with complete clarity exactly who was driving the continuation of this war and why. Netanyahu began carpet bombing Lebanon within hours of the ceasefire taking hold. Not military command structures, not weapons depots, neighborhoods, residential areas, people who had no operational connection to any resistance movement, no involvement in any military activity, living in zones that had nothing to do with the fighting. Hundreds killed within minutes. The strategic objective of that operation was not military, it was political. Block the ceasefire from consolidating, prevent the deal from becoming irreversible, keep the war alive long enough to reset the terms. That was the calculation. Anyone reading this strategically could see it in real time. Then Trump stepped in and publicly declared that Lebanon was not covered by the ceasefire agreement. The Pakistani government had to issue a direct public contradiction. Lebanon was covered. It had always been covered. Everyone who had been in the room when the terms were agreed knew it was covered. The structure of the ceasefire explicitly included Lebanon, Gaza, and the surrounding region. That public contradiction, coming from a government that had co-signed the framework, was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate attempt to rewrite the agreement after the fact. And what it exposed was a fundamental breakdown in command coherence and political alignment on the American side. When your own partners have to publicly correct your stated position on a ceasefire you just negotiated, that is not a minor diplomatic embarrassment. That is a structural problem with serious strategic consequences. Now look at the Strait of Hormuz directly, because the coverage on this is almost entirely wrong and the distortion is doing real damage to public understanding of what is actually at stake. The strait is not closed. That detail is not a footnote. It is the central fact of the current situation, and it is being systematically buried under noise and misdirection. Ships from Russia are moving through. Ships from China are moving through. Iraqi vessels, Indian vessels, ships from states that stayed out of the conflict are passing through the strait without incident, without delay, without interference. The restriction is not a blanket blockade. It applies specifically and deliberately to vessels affiliated with the 5 Gulf states that entered the conflict alongside Washington, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. Those 5 states made a choice to participate in military operations against Iran. That choice has a cost. The cost is straight access for their affiliated shipping. This is not collective punishment. This is targeted strategic pressure applied with precision to the parties that bear direct responsibility for their participation in the war. That distinction matters enormously for anyone trying to assess Iran's actual strategic position right now. A state that has collapsed, that is rudderless, that is being decisively defeated, does not maintain this level of operational discipline. It does not calibrate a straight enforcement policy to this degree of precision. It does not distinguish between belligerent and neutral shipping and hold that line consistently over time. What you are looking at is disciplined deterrence. It is measured, it is controlled, it is designed to apply maximum economic pressure on the parties most responsible for the conflict, while avoiding the kind of indiscriminate escalation that would justify a different scale of American military response. That is not the behavior of a broken state. That is the behavior of a state that understands its leverage and is using it carefully. The ceasefire breakdown has a second dimension that is receiving almost no serious attention in Western coverage, and the omission is significant. After Netanyahu was eventually forced under pressure to formally accept the ceasefire terms, Washington refused to lift the siege on Iranian ports. Let that sit for a moment. A siege on ports is not a sanctions regime. It is not an economic restriction. It is an act of war. It was an act of war before the ceasefire, and it remained an act of war after the ceasefire. Maintaining a siege after both parties have agreed to stop fighting is not a gray area in international law or in strategic logic. It is a deliberate, unambiguous violation of the ceasefire agreement that Washington itself helped negotiate. And the consequence of that violation is not abstract. It is playing out in real time across global energy markets, across international shipping corridors, across supply chains that connect the Persian Gulf to every major economy on the planet. Every day that siege holds, the economic pressure compounds. Every week that passes without resolution pushes more of that pressure into the global financial system. This is not a regional crisis that can be contained within the Persian Gulf. The trajectory is deteriorating, and it is doing so because of a deliberate policy choice made in Washington. From Tehran's strategic position, the framing of this entire situation is clear, and it is being consistent throughout. Iran did not start this war. That is not a rhetorical claim. It is the factual baseline from which all Iranian strategic calculations flow. When the invasion began, the demand coming from the Trump administration was explicit: unconditional surrender. That was the stated objective. That was the framework Washington brought to this conflict. By day 39, Washington had abandoned that framework and accepted Iran's 10-point plan as the foundation for any further negotiation. Read that again carefully because it is the most important single fact in this entire strategic picture. You do not accept your adversary's negotiating framework when you are winning. You do not abandon your demand for unconditional surrender and pivot to your opponent's 10-point plan because your military campaign is succeeding. That shift happened because the campaign was not succeeding at the level required to produce the outcome Washington had demanded. Iran understood that immediately. The ceasefire was accepted on that basis, with Tehran's framework as the starting point for whatever came next. And now the argument inside Iranian strategic thinking is straightforward. The conditions that produced the ceasefire agreement must be honored before any further negotiation can proceed. The sequence is non-negotiable. First, lift the siege on Iranian ports. Second, stop the active killing in Lebanon and Gaza. Third, once those two conditions are in place, move to serious negotiation on the 10-point framework. That is not maximalism. That is the minimum precondition for any credible diplomatic process. Dismissing that sequence as Iranian obstruction misreads the strategic logic entirely and reveals a fundamental failure to engage with the actual terms of the ceasefire that Washington itself accepted. The claim that the United States achieved a clear, decisive military victory in this conflict does not survive close examination. It collapses the moment you move from describing what was damaged to asking whether the stated objectives were achieved. Yes, significant damage was inflicted on Iranian military infrastructure. That is documented, and it is not in dispute. Targeting was extensive, assets were degraded, real military capability was reduced across multiple domains. None of that is contested. But here is what the victory narrative consistently refuses to engage with. Damage inflicted is not the same as objective achieved. Those are two completely different measures, and conflating them is either analytical laziness or deliberate misdirection. If the objective was to force Iran into unconditional capitulation, that objective failed. Iran did not capitulate. If the objective was to reopen the Strait of Hormuz on American terms, that objective failed. The strait remains under Iranian enforcement. If the objective was to destroy Iran's capacity to resist further military pressure and compel compliance, that failed. The resistance is intact, the enforcement is holding, and the economic lever is still being applied. What you have at the end of this campaign is a damaged but structurally intact Iranian state, a restricted but operationally functional strait, an ongoing and deepening economic shock spreading through allied Gulf economies, and a ceasefire agreement that the winning party, according to its own narrative, is now openly violating. That is not the strategic profile of a winning campaign. That is the profile of a stalemate at best. At worst, it is the profile of a campaign that achieved tactical results while failing at the strategic level entirely. The question of Iranian leadership continuity is being weaponized as a narrative tool in Western coverage, and it needs to be addressed directly. The suggestion running through multiple outlets and commentary channels is that the new supreme leader has not appeared publicly since the conflict. Therefore, the command structure is disrupted. Therefore, Iran is more internally fractured and more strategically weakened than it is publicly admitting. This framing is doing specific work. It is designed to project an image of internal collapse onto an adversary in order to justify a predetermined strategic conclusion that Iran is finished, that the next push will break it, that holding the line on coercion is the right call. The problem is that the operational evidence directly contradicts the narrative. A state with a genuinely collapsed command structure does not maintain disciplined, calibrated strait enforcement over weeks. It does not distinguish between neutral and belligerent shipping and hold that distinction consistently. It does not negotiate detailed multi-point frameworks. It does not manage the information environment with the precision Tehran has demonstrated throughout this period. Operational coherence at this level does not emerge from a rudderless institution. The narrative is constructed to serve a purpose. The evidence on the ground tells a different story entirely. The casualty dimension of this conflict is being systematically framed in ways that distort the strategic reality. Approximately 3,400 to 3,500 Iranians were killed during the conflict. The combined casualty figures from the 5 Gulf states that participated in military operations alongside Washington are reportedly under 20. Iran's strikes, for all their scale and reach across the Persian Gulf theater, appear to have been calibrated to degrade military and economic infrastructure rather than to maximize civilian body counts. Whether that restraint was a deliberate strategic choice, or a reflection of targeting doctrine, or a capability constraint, the outcome is the same. Iran exits this conflict without the mass civilian massacre narrative being built around its conduct. In a conflict environment where information warfare is running in parallel with kinetic operations at every level, that outcome has direct strategic value. It limits the political space available to Washington and its partners to build a coalition around the next escalation cycle. It preserves Iran's standing with non-aligned states watching this conflict from a distance, and it shapes the diplomatic landscape for whatever negotiation eventually follows. Iran's demand for compensation and accountability is not a negotiating tactic designed to be traded away in the first round of talks. It is a structural element of any serious post-conflict settlement, and it reflects the actual scale of what happened. A state that absorbs an invasion, sustains thousands of casualties, including civilian deaths on a significant scale, watches its infrastructure systematically degraded across multiple strikes, and then is told by the invading party that the ceasefire terms will be honored selectively, does not simply move on and begin talks without preconditions. The demand for accountability is the rational, predictable output of that strategic experience. The Trump administration is applying a framework built on imperial power logic. The stronger party imposes terms, the weaker party accepts them, and the cost of resistance is more destruction. That framework has produced compliance in other theaters. It is not producing compliance here. The siege did not break Iranian resolve. The strikes did not produce surrender. The coercion model is failing against this specific adversary, and the consequences of that failure are being paid by the global economy, not just by the parties directly involved. The historical substrate of this conflict is not background noise. It is directly relevant to understanding why the coercion model keeps failing and will continue to fail. The 1953 coup that removed a democratically elected government, Western support for the Shah's regime during the revolution, while security forces fired on protesters in the streets, the active encouragement of Saddam Hussein's invasion of Iran after 1970, the provision of chemical weapons technology that was deployed against Iranian forces in attacks that killed and injured thousands, These are not disputed historical claims. They are documented events with paper trails, and they are part of the institutional memory that shapes every strategic calculation made inside the Iranian system. When Iranian planners assess how much pressure they can absorb before compliance becomes more rational than resistance, they are running that calculation against a baseline that includes every one of those events. They are not calculating based on the current balance of forces alone. They are calculating based on what happens to states that capitulate to this pressure. Western analysts who refuse to factor in that historical baseline consistently misread Iranian decision-making and consistently produce predictions that fail. That is not a peripheral analytical failure. It is the central reason why the coercion strategy keeps generating surprise when it does not work. The pattern this conflict has established is now visible, and it is repeating. American military power strikes. Significant damage is inflicted. Iran absorbs the damage without surrendering command and control, and without releasing its grip on the primary strategic lever, which is the Strait. A ceasefire gets negotiated, and the negotiated terms include Iranian framework elements, which means the coercion did not achieve its core objective. Washington then violates the ceasefire through continued siege and continued proxy strikes. The economic shock deepens and spreads. A new escalation cycle begins before the damage from the previous one has been assessed or resolved. Each time this cycle runs without producing the decisive outcome Washington is demanding, Iran's deterrent credibility strengthens. Each failed coercion attempt adds another data point to the argument that pressure against Iran produces resistance, not compliance. Each cycle that ends in a negotiated ceasefire, based on Iranian framework terms, demonstrates to every other state watching that the coercion model has limits. That is where the strategic balance shifts, not in a single dramatic turning point moment, incrementally, quietly, through the accumulation of failed attempts and the credibility they transfer from one side to the other. The next American military strike against Iran, if it comes, will not break this pattern. It will accelerate the economic deterioration that is already in progress. It will extend the Strait crisis further into the future. It will deepen the regional instability across Lebanon, Gaza, and the Gulf, and it will open a window during which other actors, Russia and China specifically, will make calculations about how to use that window to advance their own strategic positions. The escalation pathway from a direct American military engagement in the Strait does not have a controlled endpoint. Nobody in Washington has a credible answer to what happens in the second and third order after that strike lands. The consequences of this trajectory go far beyond this moment and far beyond this region. The strategic logic of continuing to apply a model that has already failed is not strength. It is the refusal to read the evidence in front of you. And that refusal is costing the global economy more every single day it continues. This war should not have started. After day 39, there was a clear path out of it, and that path is still technically available right now. The mechanics are not complicated. Lift the siege on Iranian ports. Stop the active strikes in Lebanon and Gaza. Let the ships of non-belligerent states and eventually all states move through the Strait under a negotiated framework. Then enter serious negotiation on the 10-point plan that Washington already accepted as the foundation for talks. That is the path. It has been the path since the ceasefire. What is blocking it is not Iranian intransigence, and it is not Iranian maximalism. The framework on the table was Tehran's framework, and Washington accepted it. What is blocking it is the continued application of a coercion model that failed once in this conflict already, and that shows no structural reason to produce a different result on a second or third attempt. The world economy is absorbing the cost of that strategic miscalculation in real time. Supply chains are disrupted. Energy markets are unstable. Shipping corridors that underpin global trade are operating under conditions of enforced uncertainty. And the longer this runs without resolution, the higher that price climbs and the harder the eventual correction becomes. That is where this stands. That is the actual strategic situation stripped of the narrative management and the victory claims. Everything else is noise.